Hello and welcome to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard. Thank you so much for joining us again. We're going to be speaking with Cara Bowman this morning. She's a licensed marriage and family therapist, certified grief and trauma counselor as well. She's joining us to talk about her new book entitled Heartbreak to Hope, Poems of Support for Grief and Loss. She's going to talk about how the book can help guide people through their experience of isolation, sadness, and grief, of losing loved ones and not being able to honor them like we normally could before the pandemic. Welcome to Health Professional Radio, Cara.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, I did, of course, mention that you're a family therapist, licensed marriage and family therapist, certified grief and trauma counselor. Give us a little bit of your background. Tell us who you are, and then let's talk about grief or the lack thereof.
Sure. I'm a person who went through tremendous trauma in my life. I had lost many people to all kinds of things: murder, suicide, an accident, cancer, MLS. And because of that, I decided to go back to school midlife and become a therapist, and started working at hospice, and was immediately drawn to people's pain and grief because I understood it viscerally. I could guess what they were going through, and they were shocked to be understood even better than they understood themselves. So that's a little bit of my story, and now my practice focuses on grief and trauma, which often go together.
When you say that grief and trauma go together, not the trauma that has caused the grief, the trauma that maybe caused the death of the person that you're grieving or attempting to grieve, but the trauma of the grieving process itself?
It can be either. It can be a traumatic death, and it can be that somebody has past trauma in their life that they might not have even identified before, and that makes it difficult for them to grieve. Or the grief feels particularly traumatic. Somebody might lose somebody in a non-traumatic way, but because of past trauma in their life, it feels traumatic to them. And I think that's the case with a lot of healthcare workers right now during COVID. The trauma of having to work under COVID and multiple losses then makes grief compound when they do have a grief.
You know, and when you think of Lyme, who've been, come to be known as frontline workers, because this is definitely a war, normally, under normal circumstances, they experience loss in the normal day-to-day activities of their particular specialties. They experience loss. It's to be expected. But this multiplied, continuous, nonstop, seeing people losing their lives, young, old, different ethnicities, all across the board, and having almost no break in it whatsoever, that is traumatic in itself.
Absolutely, it is. People who experience many losses have compound grief, which is multiplicative. So losing two people is not twice as hard as losing one. It's akin to 4 times as hard. They also have lower resilience because of the little losses they're facing every day in their jobs, and they have no time or space to grieve. Usually one death needs to be grieved thoroughly before another is grieved, and they don't have the luxury of doing that. So many people are in maybe a low-level state of shock, and they're just getting through. They're just hanging on. I think healthcare workers have many losses that they don't even recognize. It's easy to recognize the loss of a loved one or the loss of a patient that you've become attached to. But it's not so easy to recognize the non-concrete losses. People can lose trust. They can lose hope. They can lose their belief in how things work. So there are all kinds of non-concrete losses that people are also grieving without realizing it.
Talk about people who have decided or are trying to put up a wall against all of this trauma, this pandemic, the loss, the uncertainty. We've never been through, in my lifetime, and I'm sure yours as well, you've never been through something quite like this on this level. Talk about those who are putting up walls, hoping to maintain some semblance of sanity.
No, absolutely. That's a coping mechanism, and sometimes people need to do that. In war, soldiers need to do that. They need to put up a wall in order to function. The problem is that the grief doesn't get processed, and it needs to get processed later. So as long as you recognize that you're doing that at the time, it can be a coping mechanism to help people get through. When I talk about grief, a lot of people ask me, how do I grieve? What do I do? And I talk about balancing three things. If you can picture a triangle, one thing is feeling. You need to feel the feelings of grief. One thing is distracting. You need to have a break from feeling the feelings because they can overwhelm you and incapacitate you. And a third thing is replenishing, and that is very personal. Whatever you do that actually refills your emotional gas tank. It can be taking baths, taking walks, talking to a friend. And so if you think in terms of balancing those three things, when I mention them, most people can immediately see where they're spending a little too much time and where they need to spend a little bit more time. Some of my poems, maybe I could read a poem that speaks to what to do.
I'd like for you to read one of your poems and talk about your book, Heartbreak to Hope, Poems of Support for Grief and Loss, and talk about how poetry can be an effective outlet when dealing with pain and grief, especially now.
Sure. Thank you. So I'll read a poem called Love. It says, take good care of your precious pain. Wrap your strong arms around it. Hold it against your warm chest. Rock it gently, telling it softly that it is loved. It is needed. It is important. It makes perfect sense. And love it just as it is in all of its agonizing beauty.
Why did you decide to write Heartbreak to Hope, Poems of Support for Grief and Loss?
Well, I hoped to do a few different things. I had a lot of clients who had books given to them, or I would recommend books, and they told me one after another that the books would just sit on their nightstands. Mm-hmm. And they just don't have the bandwidth when they're grieving to read a lot of complicated, long information. And I imagine a lot of healthcare workers don't have the bandwidth and don't have the time either. So I wanted to give people bite-sized pieces that would capture how they were feeling, maybe help them identify some new feelings they didn't even know they were having, and help them feel not alone, because if it was in a book, then somebody else had felt that before. And then I tried to also get in a little bit of education. So the poem I just read teaches people what to do, how that they need to feel, they actually need to feel, and feel in an atmosphere of self-compassion, and that's how to grieve.
Take good care of your precious pain. Now, I understand it as embracing the grief as a natural thing, as something that's going to have to be dealt with, and, deal with it as best you can. But that seems to be an overall strategy. What about people being so different in so many different ways, grieving in so many different ways, having to deal with it in so many different ways?
Absolutely. There's no one way to grieve, but there are some tasks that need to be done in order for somebody to process and move through their grief. And they no longer talk about healing from grief. The preferred language now is accommodating the grief. So the grief will always be part of you, but hopefully a less sharp, painful part, in a part that's not running the show, a part that you've integrated into yourself. And so people can grieve very, very solitarily. People can grieve with others. People can grieve. Some people need to say a lot of words, and other people don't need to say any words. So there are a lot of different ways to grieve, but there are some jobs that kind of need to be done. There are a lot of different models of grief. One I'll just briefly mention is by Dr. William Worden, and he talks about 4 tasks that need to be accomplished, and they really need to be allowed. So as long as you aren't pushing the grief aside and stopping them, this is what will happen. The first is accepting the reality of the loss. So at first people have disbelief in that a death is real, or in the case of healthcare workers, that so much has been lost. Then the second is to feel the emotions, and that's what I was just talking about. The third is to adjust to the new world without your loved one. And so it's, what does this mean now in my life? And the last is to find an enduring connection while imagining a new way forward. And And I could read a little poem about that if you'd like.
Yes, I'd enjoy it.
It's called Your Life. What are you going to do with your house now that the foundation has crumbled? Are you going to let it decay while time and weather carry it toward the grave? Or are you going to rebuild, more magnificently, a palace that wouldn't have been possible without the footprint of the one that came before?
That's powerful. That's extremely powerful.
Thank you.
That is powerful.
Thank you.
Kara, where can our listeners get a copy of your book?
The Heartbreak to Hope is sold in any place books are sold, any bookstore, and it's on Amazon as well.
Right. Well, I appreciate you joining us here on Health Professional Radio. I'm hoping that we'll talk again as this pandemic hopefully winds down, and we can talk about how maybe some of these strategies have been received by some of the people that you deal with in your practice.
I would enjoy that. Thank you very much for having me on, and I wish everyone the best.
You've been listening to Health Professional Radio. I'm your host, Neil Howard, in conversation with Kara Bowman, author of the book Heartbreak to Hope, Poems of Support for Grief and Loss. Audio copies of this program are available at hpr.fm and healthprofessionalradio.com.au. You can also subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, listen in, download at SoundCloud, and be sure and subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com, Health Professional Radio.